This is, oh,
We're live.
we're live.
We are live.
Everyone. My name is Tanya Love, and I work with Carol Fife. And that person,
It's Carol Fife.
Hi, how are you doing, Carol Fife? Let's do
Tanya,
some.
yeah,
love-
I'm well. I'm doing okay. Another day.
That's another day.
It's another day. It's been a long day.
It's been a long day.
Yeah.
What's going on? What happened today?
I don't remember.
What's a day in the life of Carol Fife?
A day in the life of Carol Fife is waking up, having a hot cup of tea, and doing yoga, and then meditation, so I can deal with everybody who's trying it on a regular basis, and I stay zen. And then I try to answer emails. I usually get about 1,000 a day, and and then I start receiving calls from all over the country about doing all of the things, and then I just don't remember anything after that. Lots of meetings.
Thank you. Well, anything else you want to share with what happened this week? Any highlights that you want to share? Good things. I can tell you that I watched Star Trek all week because last week was the anniversary of Leonard Nimoy's death, who's Spock. And so I watched old Star Trek episodes, and they were very entertaining.
I'm going to have to take your word for that because I don't really believe you, but okay. I mean,
yeah.
Whatever you say.
Okay.
It was a spirited city council meeting this past Tuesday. We were able to get something very, very important, very historic passed through the city council. It's the macro model. It is a model that gives us an opportunity to have a non-police response to calls that come through that would typically go through the police department, but now the city council passed it on to come through the fire department. There's a huge difference in how the fire department responds to emergencies versus the police department, and it's something that the community has been advocating for years. It first came through Councilmember Kaplan, and I believe it was Councilmember Noel Gallo. It's been at least a year now that the model has been going through the city council. So we finally passed it, and I will say, y'all ain't heard it from me, but it was a little bit of drama. There were so many false narratives going through city council. The city attorney actually called me and said that I was going to have to recuse myself from the vote because there were some rumors going around that I would benefit financially if, girl, they tried it. They were trying to catch me up on some things that weren't even true. Lots of rumors. No one ever called me to find out any details. There was actually only one person who called and checked in and said, girl, this is what I'm hearing. I'm like, let me tell you all the ways that those are lies. But I know where it's coming from. A lot of this misunderstanding and confusion comes from one primary source, and we know who it is. Y'all can bet who it is. But once again, it was not true. There were no conflicts of interest. There was no unethical behavior. And I will always legislate and work on behalf of the people, not staff, not anybody else, but the community. So it ended up right where it was supposed to be in the first place. So I'm excited that we're on track.
Yeah, I'm super excited that it's going to the fire department. I mean, we all know that the fire department works in service of the community, and most people love the work that they do, trust the work that they do. They already come as part of an EMT response, so they always tend to go to incidents anyway outside of just the fire incidences. So I'm super excited about it and can't wait for it to get started.
And I want to just say one more thing about that, Tanya, and it's not you. Listen, folks, when the city of Oakland has an opportunity to do work that should come through the city, that's where it should go. In this whole neoliberal way of doing economic business, these days, what happens is what should be governmental responsibilities get pushed out to non-governmental organizations. So what happens is we start to privatize and semi-privatize what should be government business. When it's government business, the people have a right to inquire, to look into, to oversee. When it's not government, the public does not have the same kinds of rights. So what you will see me do as a city council person is try to work in-house so that you all have the ability to scrutinize everything that we do. If it's external, we don't have that same ability. So when people say Carol is trying to do A, B, C, and D, what Carol is trying to do is give community more oversight into what should rightfully be the job and the opportunities for people to dig into what's happening. I just want to say that for the record, because folks are going to try to tell you otherwise. And always say, did you ask Carol about that? Did you call her and ask her? Because I know she might be hard to get to, but Tanya's always available. Did you try to ask her office what's happening? If they didn't do that, it's usually some garbage. Next, let's keep it rolling.
Right. So on that note, it's an exciting time of the year for folks who are super wonky. And what time is that, Carol?
Budget time.
It's budget time. So we're about to do a little bit of budget 101 and kind of talk about what's going on with the budget process and how you can be involved. I'm about to share my screen because I have another wonderful PowerPoint presentation. I know you're super excited about that, Carol. It's your favorite thing ever.
Ever.
And so let me remove my window so you guys can see what I can see. It's budget time. Woo!
You like this way too much. It's too much.
I really, really don't. But I'm super juiced to actually learn something new. And so that's what gets me excited. And I've been, trying to get everyone involved in the budget for as long as I've been nosy about Oakland politics. And so now I get to be on the inside and learn the weeds. And so, but at the same time, like we always want to do, we always want to share with you. We always want to make sure that everyone can, as much as possible, can be engaged. And so that's what we're trying to do. So first off, before I get started on anything, I want to share with you guys that all the information that you could possibly need and want to learn about the budget is on the Oakland City website. And it's here at this link, which someone will drop into the chat. And it's, oaklandca.gov topics fiscal year budget 2021-2023. And I'm going to go to the website real quick so you guys can see where you can find information. I went to that link. And so here it is. They have handy budget 101 presentation. So some of the slides that I'm going to share with you come from that budget 101 presentation. They also have frequently asked questions. And then you can actually, on this website, is where you will hear about the budget process from the administration's point of view. Keep that in mind. Everything that they're sharing on here tells you where they're coming from when it comes to the budget and what they would like to see happen. Okay. And then, going down, they tell you the budget process and give you some dates. I will go over that later. There's also reports that you guys can download, reports that were given to city council and relevant to what they're calling the fiscal crisis that we're experiencing right now. Carry forward information and an Excel file that's probably really wonky and hard to understand, but it's there so you guys can see it. So it's very transparent. And then, news regarding what's going on around the budget. And as you can see, they're really trying to talk about the current fiscal crisis a lot. So we're gonna start off with just a basic presentation of, coming from that budget 101 presentation. And then we're also going to have another presentation from a guest who's going to kind of give us a little counter narrative on, the budget austerity narrative. All right, you ready, Carol?
Ready.
So 2021, 2023 budget process. This is the time where the city council, along with input from the mayor, city administration, city staff, and the public, can decide on the budget for the next 2 years. So for those of you who don't know, Oakland's budget pays for city services. You know, that services that Carol was trying to talk to you guys about, that stuff that the city should be taking care of. That's what our budget kind of helps pay for via staffing, programs, large departments like Department of Transportation, Department of Violence Prevention, the Housing and Community Development department, stuff like that. The budget is decided in a 2-year cycle on the odd year. So you see it's 2021, 2023. They look at it at a 2 years at a time. But in the middle of that cycle, they go through what's called a mid-cycle adjustment during the even years. And they have to adjust the budget, what they had decided on previously, according to that year's revenue and expenses. So what we're looking at today is just a projection, right? But we don't know what's going to happen next year, right? So they have to adjust what we're going to decide this year according to whatever happens next year. I hope that was clear. Was that clear, Carol? Was that confusing?
It was a little confusing.
A little confusing, but that whole thing is confusing. But anyway, we are now beginning a 2-year budget cycle. And so what's happening now is that the city council is going to decide what the budget for the city is going to be over the next 2 years. Okay?
Okay.
So how is the city's budget funded? Okay, so it's funded via taxes and service fees and grants and bonds that are on the ballot, like Measure KK or Measure V or R or STUV, all those ballot measures that are, on the ballot that we vote on. There's also the taxes. So those who have, own property, whatever kind of property, whether it's a house, commercial property, apartments, those who own those things, they have to pay taxes every year. Service fees, like if you are trying to start a business and you have to pay a license fee, or you park in the wrong space and then you have to pay a ticket, or those kind of things. Those fees also is revenue for the city. And then grants. Sometimes the federal government gives money to the city of Oakland to pay for things. Sometimes the county gives money to the city of Oakland to pay for things. All of these different sources are what's called the revenue. Now, just to let you know, when homeowners or landowners or property owners pay a tax, not all of the money that they are paying goes to the city of Oakland. Actually, only a small percentage of that money goes to the city of Oakland. The rest of it can go to the state or other government agencies. Again, all of this can be found on that website that I just pointed out to you. Okay? How's that? Was that clear, Carol?
Yes.
Cool. Let me know if you have any comments, Carol, that you want to interject, or if you see any questions from the audience, again, because I can't see the stream feed right now. I'm just looking at this PowerPoint thing. Okay.
I'll just go back really quickly because you said it was the mayor, the city council, the public, but I just want to let people know that the mayor actually creates a budget and then the city council amends that budget and plays with it a little bit. But the budget that we're working with is the budget that is developed by the mayor of Oakland. And once she develops her budget, then the city council can add their amendments and make some changes. And then it goes for deliberation in front of the entire city council.
Yes. And I'll go over that process a little bit more when we discuss the timeline.
Oh, here is a comment that is popped up from Pamela Drake. Hey, Pamela Drake. They should consider converting to a 1-year adjustment this year till we see how Pamela, what does that say?
So
the vote?
I think I get the gist, though. She's saying it should be a 1-year budget process every year until we get over COVID, because
That's
COVID.
probably what she says. It
Yeah.
means the recovery goes.
Yes, according to the recovery. So, yeah, I don't know if that's necessarily possible quickly, because I think that might require a charter change.
Yeah, I would assume that it would take a charter change because it's part of the consolidated fiscal policy to engage in this particular process. So I don't know, but then the council made that. So I think I'm going to go back and ask that question, Pamela Drake. Thank you for asking. Shout out to Kimberly King and Kit Vac as well.
Oh, right. So the city's total annual budget is $1.7 billion. That's a lot of money. I wish I had a little bit of that. Maybe 100,000, maybe 300. Well, whatever. I want some money. Anyway, so all of this is broken down into how we receive this revenue. So again, 51% of that budget comes from taxes. 15% comes from, the service charges and the fines and the permits that I talked to you guys about. 8% comes from grants and subsidies, maybe from the federal government or from the county. 14%, again, those measures that we're talking about, measures EZ, WW, QRST, ABCD, those are bonds usually. Transfers. So real estate transfer tax. So if you buy a house and you get something, and then if you buy a house or you sell it, that transfer going from you to someone else, there's a tax for that. So all of those are transfer taxes. So, all right, clear?
Clear.
Okay. So again, where does the revenue money go? Okay. So the budget, Oakland operates on a budget that has not just two, but two major categories. Okay. One source of fund is called the general purpose funds. And so those are funds that the city council has the deciding factor on what to do with. The other set, 62%, are what's called restricted funds, meaning that we can't change how that money is spent at all. It's dedicated money. It has to go to one purpose. So a lot of times those measured taxes, like Measure WW or something like that, are specifically going to a service that needs to be paid for only with that tax. Okay. So the city council can't go back and change it. Now, if you see language in the measure, let's say Measure HH, that's the soda tax that we passed how many years ago? 3 or 4 years ago? That money in the language of that measure, it specifically says this money's going to the general fund. So that way the city council can decide what to do with it at the end of the day. But other measures, other bonds, other grants are for a specific purpose. There's no wiggle room. You can't decide where that money goes, at least not the city council. Clear? Let me know, Carol. Is that clear? I can go on to the next one.
Go.
Okay, great. So the budget process, there's a timeline of how this budget process happens. So starting in January, the Budget Advisory Commission puts out a poll, and it asks the residents in the community, what do they want to see happen with the city budget? And after that, after taking that poll, they present it to the city council. This was presented to city council at the last city council meeting this past Tuesday on March 2nd. And I'll show you guys where you can find that poll. Okay. But after that, what happens is a 5-year forecast. So even though I told you guys previously that the city council decides the budget in a 2-year cycle, the city staff actually they kind of project over 5 years what's going to happen with the budget, what they think might happen with the budget. And the reason why they do this is because they don't want the city council to make a decision in a bubble, thinking that, okay, if we're going to cut a program here, or we're going to, freeze this program right now, but then something happens 5 years down the road that could be really impactful to that one thing that they decided to cut. And so what they want is they want the city council to get a full picture of what's going on. So they'll do a 5-year forecast. So that way there's kind of a little bit of knowledge of, how a decision they make now will impact what happens 5 years from now. So they'll do a 5-year forecast and they'll present it to the city council. This is actually going to happen not next week, on the 16th at Finance Committee. So if you guys want to see a 5-year forecast of what might happen with the city budget, go to that Finance Committee meeting, 3/16, okay? Then around April time, the mayor starts engaging with the public and to hear from her, from her team, hear from you directly what you want her to do with her budget proposal. So like Carol had just said, the mayor puts forth a budget proposal, and then the city council responds to that budget proposal, and then compromises are made, and then the budget is passed. So, but up until that time, up until May, when the mayor presents her budget proposal, she goes out into the community and does listening sessions. She does one in every district, and she asks you what you guys want her to put in her budget proposal. So between now and then, she's going to start doing these community engagement meetings, and you guys should pay attention to that, and you guys should go, and you guys should tell her how you want this budget, to look like. Okay? Then on May 1st, she'll release that budget. And in between May and June, that's when the city council is like, okay, so here's what the mayor has proposed. Now we're going to go out into the community and we're going to listen to our constituents and see what they tell us. And so they'll start having their own public budget forums. So between May and June, then you'll get another opportunity to tell someone else what you think about the budget. Then in June, the city council will develop an alternate budget based off of the communications with you all that may counter or complement what the mayor proposes. That's when negotiation happens. And by June 30th, a final budget will be passed and adopted. And then a new fiscal year begins. How's that? Was that great?
That was great. That was great.
Any questions?
Let me see. Do people have questions? There's so many questions. Does the budget reflect funds received at the start of the pandemic? No, it does not. There was the CARES Act funding. That was the first federal stimulus through the Trump administration. And now we have the American Recovery Act. Is that what it's called? Biden's new federal stimulus. So all of the CARES Act funding has been expended. And now we're getting the new stimulus package that we should be, that should be coming into local cities very, very soon. Does this reflect if those funds went to the OPD instead of community resources? No. We're just talking about the budget process in general, which does include the general purpose fund that the police actually pull their budgets from. So I'm not sure if that's answering your question. But the stimulus packages are different. And I just want to be clear. The CARES Act was for COVID-related stimulus. And the CARES Act is just to make sure that people and cities keep their economies going and fill in gaps that they need to make sure that we're still operational. What percentage of the budget can the council amend? The city council has access to the general purpose fund. And that is the 38% that Tanya is highlighting right there.
Yes. So this part, they can't do anything with. It has to go to wherever purpose that fund is supposed to go to.
Yeah, that's why it's restricted. We can't touch that.
Can't touch it.
Deborah Hill is saying, and then we're going to go on to your presentation, Tanya. I know you have 20,000 more slides.
Okay.
Deborah Hill is asking, the Oakland Police and Fire take up a large percentage of the Oakland budget. Is the public allowed to review and direct what money goes where? So line items. Yeah. Nah. Tanya, go ahead.
I think what happens is that the city council can decide on general buckets, but it's the city administration that actually applies where that funding goes. So the city council may say, okay, we're going to actually only allocate 30% of the budget to OPD this year. And so then the city takes that money, and the mayor and the administration and the chief, whoever's deciding on their individual budget, decides where that money goes and how. And you might have heard that that there were cuts earlier this year, and to the city departments all across the board. The city council did not decide on how those cuts were made. That was done by the city administration and the mayor's office.
And that's really important because there was so much misinformation that Nikki Bass, the president of our city council, and I tried to correct about who was actually making cuts. COVID is being used right now as justification for increased responsibilities of the city administrator when it comes to our local budgeting. And that we have some concerns about that. So we'll get more into that a little bit later.
Yes. Okay. So I only have a couple of minutes because we have a special guest, but I just wanted to tell you guys that, again, remember the city budget advisory commission did a poll, and they presented that information to the city council on March 2nd. So that poll was done by an outside consultant called FM3 Research, and the poll can be found at the city council's calendar. So we talked about this last time, and whenever you guys want to know what's on the agenda or when a city council meeting is, you go to oaklandlegistar.com, and then when there's an agenda, they upload documents that support that agenda. And so the Budget Advisory Commission poll presentation is attached to the agenda for March 2nd, this past Tuesday. And I'll just briefly show you where, if you click the link, I think this is going to be dropped into the chat. You click the link, you'll see here, and you'll see view report. And then from that report is where you will find the results of the budget poll. And I think I have it here. Yes.
Yep.
So here's the budget poll. And it's pretty long, about 80 pages. But if you keep scrolling, you'll get to the actual research. And I think everyone should take the time to actually look at it, because they did this poll between December and January, and they talked to 1,862 people, and either by phone or by email. I think some people, answered via postcard. And then so they have all this data about who answered the poll. There's like kind of an even number of, race represented here across the board. They disaggregated the data for API community, which is important because not everyone in the API community are the same. So we want to be able to disaggregate that data. So that's what they did. They also showed who by gender filled out the poll, about 50% female, 47% male, and those who are, non-binary. They talk about the education. They go through all of these different, data on, geographics. But I wanted to show you some information that I thought was pretty interesting. So in the budget poll, they asked, what are the key issues that residents want to see addressed when it comes to the city, and what are some services that they need? And the large majority of those who responded really wanted to see homelessness and housing affordability addressed. The next topics were street and sidewalk maintenance. The next down is crime and violence. The next, education, and so on. So this is the kind of information that they pulled. They asked people, what are the services that they would like to see? They asked people, where do you want cuts to be made? They asked, where do they want, what kind of revenue that they want the city to try to get in order to help balance the budget. And they even asked questions regarding what they feel about important topics. Like one of the most important topics right now is what to do with OPD's budget. So they asked people those questions. So I really strongly encourage you all to download this budget report and take a look at yourself and see what these almost 2,000 people said. Because this is the information that right now the city administration is looking at when they're trying to come up with a budget proposal. And this is what they're sharing with the mayor when she's trying to come up with her budget proposal. So she's taking that information in and deciding accordingly, okay? But Carol Fife, she wants to hear from you. We're starting early. We want to know what you guys would like to see happen in the district. And we put this out, I think, a couple of weeks ago, right? And we've gotten 606 respondents. This is how many people have responded since yesterday. And a majority of you were District 3 residents, but we've gotten people from all over the city responding. Now, I didn't have a fancy, analysis. I don't have, the education to do all of the analysis that, FM3 did. So I just made this little rinky-dink graph. Isn't it pretty? You guys like it? That's where my Berkeley education got me. Anyway, I asked, we also asked a question, what are the top concerns that you guys feel, in Oakland? And some of, the responses were actually pretty comparable. So at least 70, so the Budget Advisory Commission's poll said 75% were into, homelessness and housing. And the respondents in Carol's budget survey is pretty close, 75%, right? But when it comes to public safety, there's a little bit of a divergence. The Budget Advisory poll said that 22% were interested, or concerned about crime. But in Carol's survey, only about 12% said that they were interested. So, but that could change. Okay, so because we're still keeping that poll out, we need you guys to, respond and let us know what your thinking is. What are some important things to you? Okay. So, I'm at time, 7:03. Ooh, any other questions?
There's so many questions. I don't even know where to start.
Well, I think why don't we table those questions to the end because we have a special guest, I believe. Is Kristen there?
Yay! I'm here.
Yay! So I will stop sharing my screen and then let you guys do your thing. And then I think, Kristen, you might share your screen.
I was going to say, I can share my screen, right?
Yeah, but can you tell us a little bit about yourself before you get started? And
sure. So
who you are.
So my name is Kristen Schumacher. I work for IFPT Local 21. We're a labor union that represents about 1,000 city workers in Oakland. And we represent everything from engineers and city planners to some of the administrative assistants in the city, architects, like folks who lead street cleaning teams. It's about 200 different job classifications across the city. And we also work in coalition with a number of other unions, including our brothers, sisters, and siblings in SEIU, the fire department, and IBEW, and some others. So I think, should I get started? Should I try to share my screen here?
Yes.
All right. And it looks like Tanya actually covered some stuff that she did part of my job for me. Let's see. Okay. Oh, man. I'm trying to figure out how to do this.
So at the bottom, there's a share button. There you go.
Oh. What? Hold on. Did that work?
Yeah,
We're good?
I think so.
Okay. So do you guys want to do questions during this or after, or how would you like to do that?
Let's do them after.
Okay. So I guess to start with, here's some lovely pictures of past budget processes that we've gone through back when we could all show up to city council meetings in person. But I wanted to start by talking about this story, this narrative that we always hear in every single budget process. Every 2 years, at least for me, it feels like we're bombarded with a bunch of news about, multi-million-dollar deficits, doom and gloom around the city's finances. And it always seems like the outlook is really, really bleak. And we're in a position of just deciding which services we're going to cut this year, this budget cycle. And then as soon as we're out of the budget cycle, it seems like that story really starts to change. And so I pulled this tweet here from the mayor and also some information about the credit upgrade that the city got back in 2018 and also in 2020. So whenever we're in the budget process, it seems like there's no resources there. The city is really struggling. But yet a few months later, sometimes in the same year, we hear that actually the economy is growing, that Oakland is booming, and that we're getting a gold star from the credit ratings agencies for our strong fiscal management. So if you've ever asked yourself what is going on here and what is the actual story with the city's budget, you wouldn't be alone in that. And, this is the typical sort of story that we hear about our resources and about our services when we have an agenda of austerity that's in place. So I think we're all here to talk about how do we fight back against that and how do we figure out what is really going on with city services and with the resources that are available. So Tanya covered some of this, it looks like, so I'll be quick on this, but just big picture in terms of how much money the city brings in and how much we spend. These big pie charts here are from the audited actuals from last fiscal year, from 2019-2020. And on the revenue side, we brought in last year $1.3 billion. On the expenditure side, we spent just over $1 billion. And in terms of where our money comes from, the biggest chunk comes from property taxes, but there's also a number of other taxes that the city actually controls more directly. Property taxes are to some extent controlled at the state level. But for example, we have a business tax in the city. We tax businesses in Oakland based on their revenue. We haven't changed that tax in almost 20 years now, but it does exist, and it's something the city could change, voters could change at any time. We have the sales taxes. We also charge for some services, things like the sewer fund, planning and building. Those are examples of services we charge a fee for. In terms of where the money actually goes, this is the whole pie, the whole city budget from last fiscal year. About 37% of it went towards public safety. That includes both police and fire. And then the remainder, the other 60-something percent, went towards a number of these other services. The thing is, a lot of those other services are actually funded from those restricted revenues that Tanya was talking about. And I'll talk a little bit more about what's been happening in those funds over the past few years, because there's kind of some unique situation going on in a lot of those services. And Tanya touched on this, but the general purpose fund is less than 40% of the city's budget. And the majority of it goes towards public safety, mostly towards the police department, with just these little slivers of it going to other services in the city, though some of those do have these restricted resources for them. So what actually is the general fund? Because that's what we almost always hear about, and that's what we mainly talk about in the budget process. The general purpose fund is all discretionary revenues in the city that are not restricted by voters, by resolution of the city council, or by state or federal law. And it primarily funds police, fire, but also public works and some general administrative functions of the city. And the money in the general fund comes primarily from property taxes. But the other two biggest sources of revenue for that fund are the business tax and the real estate transfer tax. A pretty big chunk also comes from sales taxes. The transient occupancy tax is our hotel tax. And then also utility user taxes and some fines, fees, and permits. Like any fines from parking generally would go into the general purpose fund. But importantly, some of those revenue sources are actually things that we control at the local level, like the business tax or the real estate transfer tax. And so what is going on with all these other funds in the city, the other 60-something% of the city's budget? There are actually hundreds of other funds. And if you ever want to go through the adopted budget booklet, they have like a whole laundry list of all of these funds in there and explain where the revenues come from for each of them. But we often don't hear much detail about what's going on in these other funds. And I wanted to provide a few examples of some of the bigger restricted funds and also talk about what has been happening with those funds the past few years. So the Development Services Fund, that is a fund that is for code enforcement and planning and building activities, and it's funded by fees and permits from construction-related activity. That fund actually has a really significant fund balance in it. That's when we have a surplus in the fund, it ends up going into fund balance. In other words, it's just money left over. That fund currently has about $149 million in fund balance, primarily because we understaff the services that fund is supposed to provide. And anybody who's been to the permitting counter recently probably knows that they're pretty severely understaffed and functioning largely off of overtime in that department. It's similar with the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. That's a fund where a portion of property taxes were actually dedicated by a previous city council to a special fund for affordable housing. And that has also built up a pretty significant fund balance over time. Money that is approved that goes into the fund, but ultimately doesn't always get spent. Again, largely because of understaffing and difficulty in getting these affordable housing projects off the ground. And then another example, Measure KK. That's a bond fund that was restricted by voters. It's restricted by the language of the initiative that passed. And that funds infrastructure development, in particular, affordable housing and some transportation programs. And once again, there have also been issues in actually spending Measure KK money the way it should be spent because of understaffing. But there are other special funds also for libraries. We have some parcel taxes for libraries, special sales taxes for transportation. There's a parcel tax that funds violence prevention, but also funds police services as well. That was passed back in 2014. And the sewer fund, which is fee funded, and a number of other services. So why do we often hear these two very different stories about the budget? One story about constant crisis and cuts, and another story about the city doing better and better all the time. Where does that come from? Part of that is because whenever we enter the budget process, we're usually talking about projections. We're talking about a projected deficit, how much we think the deficit will be, or more correctly, the administration thinks it will be next year or 5 years from now, as Tanya was showing with the forecast, or talking about with the 5-year forecast. There's a difference between that and how we actually do on our budget, our actuals. Also, almost all of the news coverage and almost all of the budget process focuses on the general purpose fund, which is less than 40% of the city's actual budget and resources. And often, as residents, as people who want to be involved in the budget process, we hear very little about these other funds in the city. So it can be kind of a mystery what's going on with these funds and with these services that they're supposed to resource. And then finally, I think the big picture point here is that creating this artificial sense of scarcity, creating the sense that there are no resources for us to expand services or improve them, puts us in a position of constantly fighting against cuts rather than imagining how we could build a better city. So in terms of figuring out, how I said that there's projections, and usually the narrative from the administration is based on projections, and then there's actuals. How do we as residents or regular people just interested in the budget, how do we figure out what the actuals are and how do we compare them to projections? I like to look at two main sets of documents when I'm doing that sort of analysis. So the city's budget reporting, the adopted budget booklet that is something that is a policy-making document. It is a value statement. It's produced by the city. It's typically the first draft is from the administration, and then it's amended by city council. And it's all forward-looking. It's all projections. And they also release quarterly reports on revenues and expenditures, which also rely very heavily on projections, and mostly just look at the general purpose fund. It's helpful to look at these things to see what we're projecting going forward. But I think we should always understand them as policy-making documents. They're political documents, and they're based on a lot of guesswork. The other document that I like to look at is something called the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, sometimes referred to as the CAFR. And that's the audited actuals from the city. And what's nice about these is that it's audited actuals, it's not projection-based, it's backward-looking, it's looking at the prior year, but it also follows standardized accounting principles rather than fitting within some sort of, like political narrative or political fight that might be going on in the city. It follows these standardized ways of reporting financial information. And it includes data on all citywide funds. And just to give an example of how I usually look at projections versus actuals and what the city's budgeting has been like for the past few years, this is a little clip from the 2017 5-year forecast. And as you can see, they projected a deficit every single year. This is the all funds deficit that they projected. And that's fairly typical. Usually when the 5-year forecast comes out, even in the good times when the economy was really booming in Oakland before the pandemic, the 5-year forecasts would always include straight deficits for 5 years. And since that's an older forecast, we can now look at how we actually did in those years by looking at the CAFR, the audited actuals, and just highlighting these few years that we have data for now. In 17-18, the projected deficit was $70 million. Our actual revenues exceeded expenditures by $140 million. Same thing happened the next year. The projected deficit from that 5-year forecast, $87 million. Revenues actually exceeded expenditures by $173 million. And, excuse me, in the final year, where we were projecting an even bigger deficit, we actually had an even larger surplus that year in 1920. That was last fiscal year. And we did have a small deficit in the general purpose fund last year. But this is, again, looking at the city's budget, big picture, all funds. So this is also a structural trend that has been going on for a long time in Oakland. One of the things that the administration might say, or that some people could say is, well, some years we have a bond that comes in and, we do a bond sale and we have a huge tranche of money that comes in. And obviously we don't spend that all in 1 year. So it looks like our revenues exceed expenditures. But this has been going on for over a decade. Ever since 2010, our total revenues have exceeded total expenditures every single time across the city. And that's primarily being driven by all of these restricted funds in the city that we hear very little about. And how does that happen? How do we get these surprise surpluses that we usually don't hear about in the budget process? It can really just happen in 2 ways. One is underestimating how much revenue we're going to bring in when we're budgeting. And the other is by overestimating our expenditures. And the primary way that we do that is by understaffing services. So this chart here, which I know is like a huge chart, but this is the total full-time equivalent employees reported by the city in their audited financial documents. That's in the blue, compared to the amount of full-time equivalent employees budgeted every single year. And as you can see, there was a time back 2 recessions ago when these numbers tracked with each other. But ever since 2008, there's been a huge gap, and that gap has been growing in recent years as we have hundreds of positions in the city that don't get filled, and in turn, a service doesn't get provided to residents, even though we budgeted for it. And these staffing issues have actually been most severe in some of the departments that are most critical. And this might not actually be surprising to folks who have tried to access any city services, but this is pre-pandemic here in 2019. But at that time, about 30% of the positions in planning and building were vacant. Over a quarter of the positions in housing and community development were vacant. I actually just included here the departments that were about 20% or more vacant at that time, but the list actually goes on from here. And what that means is that so I pulled this from last year's CAFR. This is the general fund spending of all departments in the city and their budget compared to their actual spending. And what you see here is that almost every single department in the services that often residents really want actually underspent their general fund budget, while the police department, and specifically sworn personnel in the police department, significantly overspent. And I do want to add that caveat that there are actually parts of the police department, for instance, like the crime lab, where folks do forensic analysis to help solve violent crimes. Some of those services in the police department are actually really critically understaffed as well, though we often don't hear about them because the sworn personnel and police overtime is often overspent so much that it eats up some of the funds that were budgeted for even those services. But what has been happening is that these surprise surpluses are used to balance surprise overspending in other departments. So even when the sworn personnel in the police department go way over budget, it seems like we always manage to find the money most years somewhere, and this is how we find it more often than not. So I think there are some questions about the administration's deficit claims, and I wanted to address some of that. So first of all, the deficit claims are based largely on projections. There was some deficit from last fiscal year, primarily because of overspending in the police department, more so than revenue loss due to the pandemic. But the city still ended last fiscal year with about $40 million in general purpose fund reserves. Right now, most cities in the Bay are seeing their revenues recover. Meanwhile, Oakland is still projecting that revenues will continue to fall. And really, I deal with a number of other cities in my work with our union members across the Bay. And Oakland is the only agency that I deal with that's still projecting revenues will go down. And those revenues were already revised downward at the mid-cycle, and they're saying it still could get worse. But even so, the bulk of the deficit projections right now are coming from the assumption that there will be continued overspending in the police department, more so than any revenue loss related to the pandemic. That is the main driver of the projected overspending in the deficit. And Tanya touched on the cuts that were made unilaterally in December. I wanted to just be super clear about what cuts have been made so far, because we've been hearing some very concerning numbers thrown out there about the level of cuts that were made so far. But some adjustments were made at mid-cycle, things like suspending the retiree medical trust payments. Some positions were frozen in non-sworn, basically all not police officers, not firefighters, all of the other workers in the city. A number of those positions were frozen. Some of the temporary staff, the temporary part-time staff, were laid off at mid-cycle, and then again in December. But the cuts that were made unilaterally by the administration, those included the closure of fire stations, which that has been partially rolled back, but also the suspension of units in OPD. And the full tally for all of these cuts that have been made so far is about $82 million. The reason I wanted to highlight that is because one of the things the administration has been saying is that we made $122 million worth of cuts in the past year, which frankly, I just don't see where that number is coming from. And one of the reasons that that's a concern is because there are some positive developments on the horizon that, of course, are not being taken into account in the administration's very conservative projections about the budget. The biggest one being that the Biden administration's relief plan as proposed, which passed the House and is now going to the Senate, included $177 million in federal stimulus funds for Oakland. We've actually now heard that that number might have gone up even higher by about $15 million, though obviously this is not set in stone and it still has to pass through the Senate. But the administration has even acknowledged that we are likely to get a healthy chunk of stimulus money to help sustain services, yet we still keep hearing this deficit number over and over and over again, and it keeps growing over time. And these funds are more than enough to restore some of the things that have already been cut, though, maybe some things we don't need to use stimulus funds for, because some of our funds have actually recovered and are doing better. It's more than enough to restore the cuts that were already made. And if we feel that's appropriate, obviously backfilling some overspending might not be the best use of stimulus money. But it also would allow us to invest in improving services and expanding services and having a different and better kind of recovery than we did after 2008. One other thing that the administration does not take into account in their projections is that we are likely to have a special election this year, and we could take revenue measures to the ballot. I mentioned the city's business tax that hasn't been touched in 20 years. We have a number of taxes controlled at the local level that really need to be updated. And our real estate transfer tax could be more progressive. Other cities tax higher rates on luxury real estate transfers. We could tax large landlords and corporate developers, but we just have to take that to the ballot, and we have to have the willpower to do it, rather than just focusing on what cuts we want to make. And, at this point, the question is no longer, are we in a recovery or not? Our revenue is going to keep going down. Most economists acknowledge that our economy really bottomed out in 2020, and now we're in the early stages of recovery. The question is more so, what kind of recovery are we going to have? And how are we going to do things differently than we did in the last recession, when we made cuts to public services and really prolonged the recession because of that, and made many people in our communities much worse off than they were before. And I like to put this up here just because it's from the ratings agencies, the same folks from Wall Street who give the city a gold star for having these surpluses. They actually released a report in 2018 where even they were acknowledging that the austerity cuts made in 2008 were a mistake and created the inequality gaps that we are still living with today. And that was partly because of our failure to choose a path of tax reform and taxing large corporations, and instead to choose to take a path of making more cuts and downsizing public services. And as many of us know, not only are we living with the inequality that really widened and grew after 2008 in a big way, but this was also acutely felt by certain members of our community. And in particular, Black Americans were more likely to lose their jobs, to struggle to keep up with their house payments, to lose access to healthcare because of the public sector job losses that happened back in 2008 and because of the cuts to city services. And one of the reasons for that, or the main reason for that, is because actually, and I think we don't talk about this enough, but the public sector was and still is the single most important source of employment for Black Americans. And that is actually true here in Oakland as well. When we look at our city's workforce, this is the demographic breakdown of all city employees. And while the city's population, I believe now, is less than a quarter African American, the city's workforce is still almost 40% African American. And then we're starting to see, we've already seen little glimpses of how these inequities can be created by cuts to city services. Earlier in the pandemic, the temporary part-time staff of the city were laid off in order to balance the budget at mid-cycle. And that workforce is actually proportionally more likely to be African American than the city's workforce at large. And not only that, they are majority Oakland residents that lost their jobs in the city. And this is my last slide, but all of this is to say that this constant narrative that we've been hearing for years, I know I'm getting tired of it. I'm sure many of you all are really tired of it. And right now, when we have the possibility of a huge amount of stimulus resources coming to Oakland, when we are in the early stages of a recovery, we can begin to talk about how we can do things differently this time and not end up with decades more of service cuts, and how we can actually staff up and well-resource our services so that they get to residents, and so that whatever budget we pass actually gets implemented the way that it needs to be. So that's all I have. I will try to stop my share screen.
It is stopped. Is everyone's mind blown right now? Do you understand why we fight for what we fight for? Kristen is like my main go-to person when I want to understand the budget and like really dig deep into it. I'm so thankful that you were able to come tonight and explain the details of what's happening in our city and why we keep doing this, why we keep getting the same results, because we keep doing the same thing over and over and over, like you said, for at least 10 years. And so there are so many questions in this chat. Do you have time to answer? I think we're going to have to probably bring you back. I know the district council members have to turn in our budget priorities to the city council president by March 15th. So this is the first step in us trying to like explain the process to people. And we still have our budget survey. So I'm going to be listening to D3 residents. So this is just a first in the process, but would you be willing to come back if we, okay, cool.
Absolutely,
So,
of course.
Awesome sauce. I don't even know where to start. Tanya, can you see these comments as well? There we go. There's one from Nathan Peterson. Nathan is asking, Kristen, why are positions being left vacant across the board? Just because of the sense of austerity or because it is known that the funds are needed to cover OPD spending?
That is a really good question. I think it's actually, I'm partly speculating here on some of this, but in some cases it's intentional, like in the police department. You know how I mentioned that the civilian services in the police department are really understaffed, like in the crime lab? I think that is partly by design, because whenever OPD has been told, make budget cuts so that you can get your budget more in line with what it's supposed to be, they make the decision to cut those positions or freeze those positions or not staff them. But then otherwise in other city departments, we have a huge issue with just attrition, with just people leaving, because the workload is so heavy if you're going to work in the city of Oakland, and because of the understaffing, and also the wages are just not competitive for a lot of positions. So like, for instance, when I was talking about the Development Services Fund and Planning and Building, for years, most of those vacancies have been among planners and also code enforcement officers, because they can just go to other cities and make more money and have a lower workload, right? Which I think most of us would make that choice for ourselves and for our families. And it's something that, because of this constant deficit narrative, we've just never addressed, because there's no willingness to improve the working conditions for the city's workforce.
Okay, so just to summarize, like higher pay in other cities, less work to do, and that is what's driving the attrition, partly, is what you're saying.
Yep.
Yeah. I think if I had the choice, well, I don't know. I work for Oakland, so I'm here. So it's clear what I'm trying to do. What other questions do we have? David said, I zoomed into Planning Commission yesterday. There's a building at 5th Street that has only 9% affordable housing at 50% AMI, which is higher than Black households in District 3. Why does Fremont have a higher inclusionary affordable housing requirement than Oakland? Why is Oakland so behind? Well, David, how real do you want to get? Because the reality is that things were created that way. I think that's part of why people elected me to the District 3 seat, is because I really care about affordable housing. And I'm sorry, I just got to tell the truth a little bit here. We had a breakdown of the results from my campaign yesterday, from a meeting that we were in with some folks who want to get more low-income people involved in the democratic process by allowing democracy dollars to be used to contribute to campaigns. And in that meeting, we found out that the bulk of the campaign contributions that came into the incumbents race were from real estate developers from across the country. So there was a lot of outside money coming in from real estate developers who wanted to do what in District 3? To develop. And in order to get real estate developers to like you, you want to give them some incentives, right? So the reality of what's happening in the downtown Oakland area the Jack London area, District 3. It's the heart and soul of the city because that's where the downtown area is. It encompasses part of the lake. And the developers who want to build here, they don't want the type of scrutiny that would necessitate addressing the housing crisis, right? So we got to be honest. We need inclusionary zoning in the city of Oakland. We needed the impact fee. If we were going to develop an impact fee program, we needed to have higher fees that weren't just a pay to play where you pay a little fine to develop affordable housing somewhere else that never gets developed. So there are a lot of layers to this thing, but when you are working for the people, especially for the Black people who have been displaced, the folks who are the majority of our homeless population, your compass, your North Star is going to look different than what it has looked like in the city of Oakland. So I'm gonna just leave that there and go on to another question. Oh,
I just want to say one thing. Not only is it important to pay attention to, budget stuff, but you also need to pay attention to the downtown specific plan, the city plan, because those are when decisions are being made about inclusionary zoning or how much is required of a developer to make affordable housing, et cetera. And those plans really dictate what is being developed at downtown Oakland or the rest of the city. So yes, David, it's important to go to the planning commission meetings to find out when those plans are being made and pay attention and participate and tell people, tell those decision makers what you want to see happen.
And actually for that particular process, residents of District 3 can go appeal because from what I understand, that planning decision was pushed through the planning department yesterday with a scant amount of affordable housing. So if District 3 residents want to see something different, you can appeal that process. And if you want to know more about how to do that, then contact our office because we know people who know how to do that. But yeah, we need more. We need more affordable housing. We need low income housing. We need social housing. There's so much we could do. We need inclusionary zoning. And we're going to get to that. We're going to definitely get to that in this district. Thank you for the question. We have another question from Mary Schindler. How are community priorities translated into budget decisions? So community priorities through listening session surveys, how is that incorporated into budget decisions? And Kristen, you've been a part of that. You've been a part of these trainings for community organizations throughout the city of Oakland. So can you say a little bit about how those processes work and how you integrate with that process?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think a big part of this is also who you have in leadership too, which is why it's so amazing to have Carol in the position that you're in, Carol, because community members, it's one thing to get your voice out there and get your priorities known. It's another thing to have those actually translated into policy. But in theory, the survey that Tanya was showing earlier is supposed to inform the administration's budget that they're putting together. Council members then come up with their budget priorities based on what they're hearing from their constituents. And then then there's all of the sort of like wheeling and dealing of figuring out how to piece together a final budget that gets passed based on those priorities. But it's really a matter of going to budget town halls, making sure you're telling your council members what your priorities are and that they're hearing that loud and clear, showing up to council meetings during the budget process and speaking at those council meetings so that people can make their budget priorities informed by what you have to say. And then also staying tuned throughout the whole budget process because things start to move really fast at a certain point. Once the mayor's budget comes out, the city council president's budget comes out, and all of the council members' budget priorities are out there, then we get to the real negotiation of how are we going to pay for all of these things and where are we going to find the money? How are we going to work them into the budget? And you have to be really vigilant in showing up and making your voice heard at every single one of those council meetings around the budget.
And next week, why is it everyone? Anyway, next Monday is an opportunity for the public to engage in this budget process with the city council because next Monday, March 8th, there's a finance committee meeting, and that's when some of these conversations are going to start happening. So I encourage everyone who cares about this process, who wants to learn more or also wants their voice heard around budget priorities to come to the Finance Committee next Monday. What is it, at 1:30?
Yep, that's right.
1:30, through Zoom. It's the same way we've been participating, but definitely show up. And if you want more information about that, we can drop that in the chat as well. Okay, I'm going to take maybe a couple more questions because Coming to America is out tonight. Coming to America 2, and I know everybody wants to go see that. Okay, is there a race and equity requirement for public art in these developments? And so in the private developments that are happening, is there a race and equity? No, if it's a private development, a private developer can do what they want to do in their particular development. I know a lot of organizations, some of these folks that are building these things will go and get local artists to do work in their developments to make it look like their spaces are not gentrifying spaces. But I don't believe that there is a requirement that we can impose on a private developer for their particular project. Tanya, do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, if it's a public development, then there's community benefit agreements, and those things can be requested in those agreements. But if a private developer, they have very little forcing them to do anything that the community would like to see. And so that's when going to planning commission meetings and appealing decisions is important, because then if it's appealed, then the city council can say, I kind of like to see something like this happen. And then maybe the developer's like, okay, well, to avoid having to go through that whole process, they may decide to do it themselves. But other than that, no, there's no real requirement.
Okay, let's do maybe one more question and then we're gonna wrap it up. And this recording is playbackable. I just made that word up. If there was a lot of information that was shared tonight, once again, I want to give a shout out to Tanya and Kristen for making this presentation available. You can go back and rewatch it, watch little parts, watch the whole thing. But we have a comment from Jay that says, tax the rich and buy blocks of the city for public services. Yes, Jay, that's a great way to end this broadcast tonight. Tax the rich. I mean, Oakland has some of the highest property taxes on homeowners. We, have not touched these wealthy corporations who've made. Y'all know how much Clorox has made because of the pandemic by selling bleach wipes? They had to open up whole new operations in order to address the need. And Clorox is based right here in Oakland. So we got to look at the corporations who've been making money hand over fist and start, demanding that they take care of the cities where they actually are based and that they benefit from. So we got to tax the rich. We got to tax the big corporations and businesses who benefit from this beautiful city that we all love. So Jay, right on. Buy blocks for the city for public services. Let's not reduce public services where people are already just being run over by streets that are not maintained, by trash. We need our city workers to stay employed. As Kristen said, this impacted Black people in the last recession more than anything, through the loss of homes, loss of jobs, loss of income, loss of healthcare. We cannot afford to make that same mistake again. And what you all can count on is that I'm going to bring you the truth, that my team is willing to open up all of the books so that you all have the information and the data that you need to make appropriate decisions and to push on us. Everybody is not operating on the council in the way that I am. I'm trying to do things differently because what we've been doing to date has us exactly where we are. And we need to change this drastically because people's lives literally depend on it. And I expect you all to have my back, and I will bring you everything that you need so that we can transform the city and so it can be as great as we know that it can be. Kristen, I appreciate you. I'm thankful for you. Tanya, thanks again. If you have some final
I do. I want to share my screen a little bit to talk a little bit more on how to engage in the process. Do that. Here. I've been told from the current slide, you guys don't see all the other stuff on the side, but so basically how to engage in the budget process. First and foremost, again, please fill out Councilmember Fife's budget survey on Google. It will help us out greatly for when, as she had mentioned, we have to submit our budget priorities by March 15th. But if you know some people who missed this live stream today and want a refresher on the budget process and learn how to engage, we're going to have a webinar on Saturday, March 13th at 11 a.m. You can register via Zoom. Registration is limited to 100 people because, I'm poor. But if everyone can, register ahead of time and we make sure that you get in, again, Saturday, March 13th, 11 a.m. We'll go through this process again, and we'll also have some time possibly for breakout rooms, etc., and to hear from you what you guys would like to see. The third thing is start attending the budget forums from the mayor, like I had indicated before. She's going to want to go out in the community, and she's going to want to hear from you what you guys want her to put in her budget proposal. So make sure to look out for those release dates. If you go to the website that I presented earlier, she'll probably post those dates in that. But then she also does, her own newsletter. So sign up for her newsletter, find out when she's going to do her budget forums. The other thing is attend city council meetings like Councilmember Fife talked about. Attend the committee meetings, the finance committee meetings, because now it's all going to be about the budget. And so it's an opportunity for you to get some insight on what the city administration is sharing with the city council, but also to kind of hear and listen to some things that are important to each individual council member. And then during those city council meetings, that's when they'll announce when they're going to do their own public budget forums. So right now, we don't know when those public budget forums are going to happen, but pay attention down the line, because then they'll start sending out information at the city council meetings, but also in their own individual newsletters. Councilmember Fife will announce it in her newsletter. And then if you live in other parts of the city, your respective council members will do the same. Finally, attend the city budget forums that each of the council members are going to put forth together, and then let us know what you think about the mayor's budget proposal. If you think that she's cutting way too much in a certain department, let us know. If you think she's not putting enough money into another department, let us know. That's the time to do so. And like I said, continue watching the city council meetings between May and June where the budget is discussed, and make comments. Show up for us, because that's the way we know what you would like to see happen. And then that is it, folks. As always, you can email us at district3@oaklandca.gov. Tell us what you're thinking. But yeah, thank you guys so much for tuning in.
I know. We had a lot of comments in there. I think we got to go back and answer some of these questions, Kristen. Do you have any last words you want to share with the folks who tuned in tonight?
All I want to say is just, the resources are there to meet the community's needs. We just have to go out there and get them. We have to make sure they're going to the right places. And I feel like you all have laid out a really clear way for everyone to fight for a better city and to fight for a better Oakland this time around. And thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, this was awesome. I feel informed. I hope the people that tuned in feel more informed. And once again, if you didn't rewatch it, watch it multiple times so we can all be experts. We can't just hold this information. Share it widely. Tell people how to get involved. I want to say, Ashara, love you. Mush, District 1, thank you for tuning in. We got folks from all over the city that are tuning in to listen to these things. So she said, a council person is the realist when you have a District 1 resident like me feeling blessed from this knowledge and education. Right on. That's awesome. That's awesome. Alisa, thank you for tuning in. Once again, everybody, we love y'all. We're going to keep bringing it to you. Go watch some TV and get something to eat. Appreciate y'all. Bye.
Let your soul glow.
Let your soul glow, baby.